Welcome to the Ipsos Politics Talk podcast. My name is Keiran Pedley. Well, if you ordered Donald Trump and Kemi Badenoch for Christmas, then you're in luck. If you didn't, sorry, you must have been very naughty this year. But on this podcast, we're going to be talking about public opinion, both this side of the pond and the other, looking at those different election results and what it means for politics in the UK moving forward. And to do that, I am joined by two of my favourite people to talk about politics with, Holly Day and Cameron Garrett. Welcome to you both.
Hello, Keiran.
Hi, Keiran.
Enjoying the festive references there. It's not
Too
far,
early.
Not far away.
It's too
It's
early.
not far away. It's not far away, Holly. Cameron, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm sorry I'm not Stephen Bush. I won't have a word with you both for cheating on me like that.
What can I say? That's an apology most people make. Where shall we start?
Shall we start with the elephant in the room? That is the Republican Party.
Very good.
Told you I had a good joke. Did you choose that one? Keiran, what do you reckon?
We've just got to
What's
think about
your
how to get
take on the
donkeys in
US?
now. I mean, there's two ways to look at this, right? There's the actual result itself, which I'll probably talk about a bit, and then there's obviously what it means for here. I think that there was always a risk with the polls being the way they were that either Trump or Harris could sweep the swing states and win in quite a convincing manner, and that'd be a bit of a surprise to people because everything we knew about the polls was that they were neck and neck. And that's kind of what happened. There is still a sense that the polls understated Trump a little bit, both in the swing states and nationally, although there is a slight complication with that in the sense that a lot of the votes in California take weeks to be counted, and so actually the margin of 4 points, a 4-point national lead for Trump, isn't going to be what it ends up. In fact, I think it's about a couple of points now already. So, I mean, the polls didn't do awfully vis-a-vis the result, but there is a sense that they understated Trump again from a sort of polling perspective. Look, from Trump's perspective, it's a definitive win in a sense of winning the popular vote, the first US Republican presidential candidate to do that since 2004, so 20 years. He won all the swing states, so this does feel like, whereas the win over Clinton was very much a shock, everyone took a lot of time to get their heads around, he did so, losing the popular vote. This one feels quite definitive. I mean, there is a quirk in the system still, though, in the nature of the Electoral College, that a 1-point swing in 3 states in the Midwest and Harris would have won, because actually the popular vote doesn't matter. That's still the case even when Trump wins it, as it was when he lost it. But politically, with him winning the presidency, the Republicans in charge of both houses, he is a political king for the time being, right?
I don't know where you're going to go with that.
Yeah, I mean, but then, politics has a habit of changing very quickly, right? And so the nature of American politics tends to be that midterms come in 2 years' time, and then the opposition party tends to do well. And while there's a lot of soul searching on the Democrat side about why they lost, and that's understandable, I'd probably still make them favourites to win the presidency next time. But that's all for the future. But I guess what I'd like to talk about today is kind of what it all means for here. I think there's an interesting discussion about how we all consume American culture and American politics quite widely in the UK, and there's a lot of discussion about that. But presumably this does have real-world consequences too, Cameron. So what does public opinion in the UK say about the result, and where do we think we go from here?
So Starmer was quite quick off the bat, wasn't he, to congratulate President-elect Trump. I think he did it. He'd put out something before even it was called on some networks yet, so very quick off the bat, and obviously trying to improve a relationship there. There was that story during the US election about them sending Labour supporters over to help canvass, etc. So there's this perception that it's going to be a strained relationship for Labour, but I think they'll be trying to overcome that. And they did have dinner with him a while ago, didn't they? In the UK specifically, Britons would have preferred Harris to win, as I'm sure Labour would have too. We're not that fond on Trump, so we've got 58% unfavourable to him to 1 in 4 favourable. Pre-election, we had 3 in 5 saying a Trump win would be bad, a similar amount saying it would have a negative impact on the UK-US relations. So we don't necessarily have a positive outlook on him, but it is going to have a real-world impact here. So we've started talking about Starmer travelling abroad, etc. And he's potentially doing that to build up some of these allies and relationships across Europe as Trump's position on Ukraine is in question and what impact that will have on us. I think today he's also said he wouldn't sign off on the Chagos deal with Mauritius for us as well. So that's going to have impact here too. So there is going to be some long-term impacts, and Brits aren't particularly fond of him, but I think they're going to have to get used to him pretty quickly.
I mean, Holly, it feels like he's on the news a lot. I mean, obviously he's just won the election there, but just generally speaking, I think over the next 4 years, Trump's going to be on the news a lot. How do you think that's going to interplay with our politics, right? Because there's going to be a lot of, particularly on the conservative, small c conservative side, the right of British politics. He's never far away from people's minds, is he?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen quite a few politicians from our neck of the woods getting quite friendly with him over the past couple of years, going to his conventions, going to his rallies. Nigel Farage is probably the one that springs to mind the most. And I think given the Reform UK results in the election and their kind of continuing popularity in the polls, that's probably going to be a relationship to look out for over the coming years. I think also whenever anyone becomes the president or becomes the prime minister, we've seen that this with lots of prime ministers in the UK in years gone by, they want to make their mark early on. I mean, we know that Trump has already been president before. We know that he made his mark, and he's not the sort of guy that's going to shy away from making kind of bold decisions regardless of who he's going to set up front.
Like putting Elon Musk basically in charge of America.
Yes, in terms of who he's going to choose.
Please don't suppress this podcast.
Who he's going to choose in his top team. I think I saw earlier today there's a Fox News presenter who's now the Secretary of State for Defence. Yeah. Which I don't think anyone was predicting, and I'm not even that sure who he is, so I'm going to need to read up on it. But obviously that also means other world leaders are going to have to read up on them and figure out who these people are, what their politics are, how they can work with them. And when you've got such real world issues as Russia, Ukraine, as Israel, Gaza, as the European Union, as the US-China relations, all of these are questions that are way bigger than one single state and are going to require the likes of Donald Trump and Keir Starmer to either come to a consensus or not and make decisions on how these things play out that are going to affect many other nations across the rest of the world.
We'll probably come back to Trump throughout this podcast, but obviously the big news that is arguably the most important for our politics domestically, for at least in the medium term, is Kemi Badenoch's election as Tory leader. We've got our latest Ipsos political pulse out this week, Holly, haven't we? Which looks at sort of her favourability ratings and some other supplementary questions. Where are we starting to net out with the public on Kemi Badenoch?
Kemi Badenoch is an interesting one because she's not been about for that long, really. 2017, she came into Parliament. She had a pretty meteoric rise, I would say, and was always kind of earmarked as the sort of person who the party thought would do well. Given recent electoral results, it then depended who was kind of left as to who was going to face her.
They've worked through lots of them.
yeah, they've gone through a few. But it didn't necessarily surprise me that she's become leader. In terms of how people perceive her, awareness levels are pretty low amongst the general public. So her first job is for people to get to know her. I think Conservative voters will know a lot more about her than the general public do. Only a quarter of people say they know a great deal or fair amount about her. So I think that's got two sides to it. One side is she's got quite a lot of room for manoeuvre in generating that opinion amongst people who are currently a bit unaware and don't know what's come before. The flip side to that is you can get stuck in a position that Starmer did for quite a long time where people didn't know what he stood for. Now, I don't think that Kemi Badenoch's going to be in the same position because
she has some quite strong opinions.
She's not afraid to voice her opinion, and we've heard quite a few of them. I mean, one of the funny things is we know I do a lot of pub quizzes, right? And you can always tell.
Comes up sometimes, yeah.
It's not like the most scientific way of figuring out what people know about her. But in a quiz I did on Monday, a picture flashed up and it was just, who is this person? And I obviously was fastest finger first and got it. But nobody else in the room got it. And
was this just an anecdote so you could brag
No,
on it?
well, we didn't win the quiz, but that one felt quite good. Same happened with Sue Gray a few weeks ago, but that wasn't as surprising. But it just tells you, in a room full of kind of normal people, apart from being quizzes, the people just don't really know who she is yet. So I think the first few months, particularly now we've just had the budget, particularly going into Labour, making some key announcements in the first few months, how she performs in PMQs, how she responds to key policy announcements, how she responds to the Trump presidency, all of these things are really going to start to shape what the initial public perception is of her. And we know from our polling that often people start from a high base and they move down. So where she can get to in terms of that high base, I think is going to be critical in terms of how she does moving forwards. But initial polls, not from us, are looking relatively positive.
I think though, when you're saying they start from a high base, she's actually not had a great start in our favourability ratings. Like 1 in 5 favourable, 39% unfavourable, -18. It's not where you'd like to start going in. So yeah,
it's because she's not very well known, though. I think that's my read.
Yeah,
on that.
but
whereas if
2 in 5 unfavourable isn't great.
Yeah, but she's a Tory party leader.
It's been worse for a lot of people in recent times.
Yeah, I know, but for your first poll, when people don't know you that well,
I read that for what it's worth. I read that as more. She's announced in the poll as Kemi Badenoch, Conservative Party leader, and so you're inevitably going to get at least 4 in 10 at the moment, just given where the popularity of the Conservatives are, say they're unfavourable. So whether that 20-odd% can grow. Holly mentioned Trump, and we sort of talked about him a bit at the beginning. What's really noticeable when you look at the cross breaks of favourability towards Donald Trump in this latest political pulse, a majority of reform voters are favourable towards Donald Trump, and a majority of everybody else is unfavourable. So it makes me think again about this whole strategic question for the Tories about, do you target reform voters, do you target Lib Dem, Labour switchers? Can you get both? How do you get both when they have very different views on what the key issues are and what they think about different players? So that stood out as a little nugget in the polling there. It sort of reflects some of her challenges. And I suppose another challenge, Cameron, is that when you put her head-to-head with Starmer at the moment, he's still preferred as Prime Minister. But then, again, maybe that's just a sign of her not being very well known.
Yeah, so overall Britain's plump for Starmer. 30% say he'd be a better Prime Minister compared to Kemi on 19, but actually there is a strong performance for neither there on 38, outperforming both of them. I think one of the most interesting numbers around Kemi Badenoch in the polling we did was how likely she is to be leader going into the next election, and opinion was split there but leaning unlikely. So again, 38% thinking it wouldn't be.
And 4.5 years would be a long slog given recent history, wouldn't it?
Well, the last Tory leader to do that long is David Cameron.
Yeah.
So it sort of tells you about the turbulence at the top of the Tory party.
When you think back to last time in 97, they did work through their leaders post-Hague. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens. We're in for a fun time. And
I think that's what's interesting in the comparison versus the Starmer numbers, because when you ask likely to be leader at the next election, he sweeps that 52% think he'd be likely to, 29% not. And you think of the not so recent past of the Labour Party, one of their key issues was that they weren't putting on a united front. They weren't together, and we know that kind of disunited parties don't often win elections. So if he can kind of maintain that, he's proven to his supporters and to the party that he's created change, that he's got them together, that they're a kind of functioning single unit at the moment. At least there's a long way to go until the next election. The Conservative Party are going to need to get those sorts of numbers and get themselves together and put on a united front to be able to challenge in the coming years.
Let's talk about Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister. So I looking at the political pulse numbers before we were sort of recording, it struck me that there were two very different ways you could interpret them. On the one hand, you look at his poll ratings individually, and they're not very good, to put it bluntly, majority unfavourable. And that's sort of the highest we've seen since he became Labour leader. But on the flip side, as we've alluded to, head-to-head, he's ahead of Kemi Badenoch on who would make the best Prime Minister. So how do we, I mean, other than, yes, you can look at it in two ways, as I've just said, how do we look at public opinion towards Keir Starmer at the moment?
I think negative ratings, and then when you couple it with that, the poll question we asked around whether you're better off or worse off, and you're getting 41% saying worse off, this is a massive problem for him that he shouldn't be sitting on, basically. Otherwise you walk into a problem like Sunak did, where you kind of you've got inflation down, you're meeting some of the goals you've set yourself, but the public aren't appreciating it.
And Joe
Biden, to read across there. Like, you can meet these goals, but you need to connect it to a tangible outcome for people's day-to-day life, and for still it is cost of living, and how are you going to get that down? We're seeing in the polling. So I think I wouldn't feel comfortable if I was him just saying, well, I'm still beating Kemi Badenoch on a head-to-head, considering, well, she has been leader for 2 weeks, to be fair, and you did win a landslide not that long ago.
I think there'll be, given the run-up to the budget, I feared for his ratings this month and the party ratings this month, aside from Rachel Reeves's individual ratings, because of the sorts of things that were expected, such as tax rises. We already knew there was disquiet because of the winter fuel issues with kind of older voters. Prior to that, there were quite, businesses also thinking they were going to struggle with the sorts of taxes that the Labour Party were talking about. I feared for his ratings, and actually his unfavourability has stayed static. It's 52% unfavourable, which is really not good. But it stayed static since the budget, and I thought that given a lot of those announcements, some of these numbers would shift in a negative direction. And in fact, when you ask people to rate the Labour Party between 0 to 10, it's slightly improved on last month by kind of 0.2%. It's not really moved, basically, and I thought things would deteriorate, and they haven't.
I wonder whether some of the negativity was baked in, though, considering they've been quite pessimistic over the summer.
It could be that, and also it could be to come at the point where these things are implemented, and at the point where people, as you said, cost of living wise, people tangibly start to be affected, like their bills start to increase, the taxes start to increase. When that starts to hit and it's bedded in, combine that with it just being winter and people kind of feeling a bit worse off and a bit gloomier during these months, I wouldn't be surprised if over the next couple of months that's where we start to see it hit.
I mean, looking at the budget, it reminds me of the post-budget polling that we produced, and actually, there was a lot of noise around it, but Rachel Reeves' personal poll ratings did improve in terms of the job she's doing as Chancellor after the budget. Labour were more trusted on the economy than the Conservatives. When you ask her about a series of the measures in the budget to do with spending on the NHS and other things, they're popular. So I think I agree, the devil's in the detail about how it actually plays out, but there's actually quite a lot in that budget that the public liked. And so I suppose it is that trait, but there's a really good slide in our pack, which I'll tweet after this podcast again, but where it showed that people were more concerned about their own personal financial circumstances, but they were slightly more likely to be reassured about public services. And I think that's the tension that you can see with these tax rises versus more money, more cash for public services. It's like, which bit do people remember the most, and how can you tell that story as a sort of political party?
And it's
forward?
It's when and to what extent people start to feel those cash injections into public services, because we know from our issues index the types of things that people care about. The NHS is always up there. People do care about the economy. People care about immigration, education. Like, these are all kind of intertwined things, and pumping lots and lots of money into public services sounds wonderful, but if on the ground people can't get a GP appointment,
people want to see is waiting list coming down.
Coming down.
Real life experience.
And in kind of real life, pumping a bunch of money into sorting kind of the background systems of the NHS is going to take time for that to happen. So I think you're kind of then at the behest of, it's a bit of a waiting game, and how much kind of grace people are willing to give you before they start to see it.
Because through word of mouth, people start talking to their friends and family and saying, "Oh, actually, I found it easier to get a doctor's appointment."
Well, and if the next time you have a budget, you're not pumping money into public services and people haven't seen it happen by that point, then you put all this money in, where did it go? And now you're not giving us any money.
I also think, to pick up on a point what Keiran was saying about what's the thing you're going to remember from the budget, I think there is a comms problem for the Labour Party to be pushing forward, that people have been talking about farmers' inheritance tax, the national insurance rise and impact on businesses, but there's minimum wage, etc., that they should really be pushing and talking about. Yeah,
these are classic Labour lines that they could, like, there are ready-made slogans from way back when that they could be churning out. And you can link
to the big issue like cost of living.
100%, yeah. And they had this problem during the election and just after he became Prime Minister, in terms of what's your message? How are you getting control of the narrative so that Conservatives don't? And at the minute, they're at a stage where Kemi Badenoch's so new that she's not had the chance to, but at some point she'll become more experienced and they'll get their stuff together, and they'll then start to be a bit of a trickier force for them to deal with narrative-wise, I think.
Let's slightly go full circle, sort of, and talk about reform and Nigel Farage very briefly, because he's been had more of a public presence in the last week or so with the US stuff, but also I think he had a question at PMQs today, and there's an urgent question.
What did he ask?
I'm not sure if it was about, I don't actually know, I didn't see it, but I think it was to do with migration figures. He's got an urgent question later. But anyway, so there's a bit more presence for Nigel Farage. Our numbers for reform in Pulse, I think, had 28% favourable, or was that right? It was a high 20s% favourability towards Reform UK. And we were talking to Ben as part of the team before we came on, that there's kind of that is another way of, as I was saying earlier with Starmer, there's two ways of reading the numbers. There's another sense of that in that the ratings aren't great for Labour and for Starmer, but actually Reform's popularity seems quite solid. And Nigel Farage seems to have the highest favourability ratings of anyone on the list of the politicians that we tested. So to some extent, whilst Labour might not be very popular, if Reform are a permanent fixture of what's going to go on in British politics, then that does kind of change the calculus about where Labour needs to be in terms of national vote share, where the Tories can get to, and so on. So I don't know if we have any thoughts about some of the data we saw for Reform, because I think what also struck me was that they're very different people. They think very differently to almost any other voting group.
I think when you look at those numbers, I'm always like, 28's like them, but 28% like them, but then you've got much higher unfavourables. But then I guess you only need to be more popular than the other guys. As long as you're polling higher than them, it doesn't really matter if you've got lots of people who strongly dislike you, which is a risk for Labour. That, yeah, they are able to grow those numbers solidly.
Yeah, and they were on an upward trajectory during the course of the campaign in the run-up to the July election, weren't they? And they've maintained some of those numbers, and a lot of the other political parties, when we put them all on our chart together, you see everyone else kind of falling off a cliff, particularly the incumbent government, Reform and Nigel Farage are managing to maintain their figures. I've not heard that much from them, which may be a good thing, maybe a bad thing in terms of them being able to maintain those figures.
Busy.
He has been busy quizzing.
Well, and Nigel Farage has been in America, so we both had things to do. But I do think your point about the Conservatives is right. The two candidates that were left at the end in Robert Jenrick and Kemi Badenoch were both of an ilk that are more towards the right of the Conservative Party, and ultimately that has the potential to cause them a problem in not just general elections but local elections, where we have seen Reform do particularly well in the past few years. So it's going to be interesting to see. I don't know if it's a bit of a waiting game, like Farage is waiting to see how Kemi Badenoch sets out a stall to then see how he can outflank, or he might not even need to outflank because he owns a lot of the issues that are kind of towards that side of the party. So yeah, I'll be interested to see what her first few speeches are, particularly on things like migration, which is the top of our issues index as of last month.
And Reform voters really, really, really dislike Keir Starmer. So like 67% of Reform voters had a very unfavourable opinion of Keir Starmer. I think it was about 84% said they were unfavourable generally. And it reminds me actually of Keir Starmer talking about illegal migration on one of his recent international trips. I was tweeting about this. I think it's a sensible thing if Labour are trying to blunt some of that, if you want to call it populist sort of insurgency. They've got to have a line on immigration, and I think that when you work on the immigration tracker we run with British Future, don't you, Holly? It's clear from that actually people do conflate legal and illegal immigration in terms of their general view of the topic. And even though legal migration is by far the larger numbers, actually, when you ask people dissatisfied with how the government handles immigration as a topic, why that is, the boats and illegal crossings are the number one issue. So it struck me that it made sense for Keir Starmer to be talking about that. At the same time, people that are voting Reform at the last election really, really dislike him and really dislike the Labour Party. So probably not any votes in it necessarily for Labour, but they'll probably want a message on that, I think, moving forward. Should we leave it there? That's all we've got time for this week's Ipsos Politics Talk podcast. My name's Kieran Pedley. Big thanks to Holly Day and Cameron Garrett for joining me as ever. If you like what you hear, please do like, subscribe and share this podcast wherever you are online these days. It seems like everyone's in different places. But for now, thanks for listening and watching, and see you soon.